Good morning, everyone. Hello. Firstly, a very warm welcome to each and every one of you in the room today, joining us online and watching us on Catch Up. Thank you genuinely for taking the time to hear this conversation and hopefully take part in the debate around the governance of football and the call from many in the industry, including women in football, for the need for further urgent reform in this space. I'm Harriet Leach, a legal director and head of women's football at Onside Law, which is a specialist sports and media law firm. And my day job, I'm lucky to work on some of the biggest projects in sport that are happening right now, both in the UK and further afield, including in the areas of governance, corporate structuring, and women's sport. And I've served as an independent non-executive on boards in football and cricket. So I'm absolutely delighted to be hosting this session today with some leading experts in this space. So just to briefly introduce you to those that are joining me on stage. To my left is Mary Galbraith, who's the chair of the Scottish Premier Women's League and programme director at Strathclyde Business School. Next to Mary is Patrick Massey, who's partner and head of UK and Europe at Portas. Next to Patrick is Laura McAllister CBE, who's on the executive committee of UEFA and is also Professor of Public Policy at Cardiff University. And next to Laura is Lynsey Tweddle, who's the strategic lead of governance at Sport England. I'm going to hand over to our experts very, very shortly, but before I do, I just wanted to take a couple more moments of your time to set the scene, because I'm very mindful that governance is a broad topic and quite complex. So I think the idea behind this session, it really builds off Women in Football's Open Doors agenda that was launched last autumn. And I understand that was Women in Football's way of saying that the behaviour around the Women's World Cup with the Spanish players and the Spanish team and FIFA's comments and remarks was not right, and that behaviour has to be called out, but also that they're striving for positive change in the industry. So I'm sure you already are aware, but just very briefly, the Open Doors agenda was all about calling for football decision-making bodies to mandate various things in their governance, which includes a minimum 30% women representation on senior decision-making boards, that there has to be independent non-executive members of senior decision-making bodies, that those members would serve for fixed terms and be recruited through transparent recruitment processes, but also that there's policies and sanctions to call out and reprimand bad behaviour around discrimination, sexual abuse and harassment, and also that there's safeguarding and duty of care policies in place to ensure that people's voices are heard, including players. So I think we're all aware that there has been some positive strides, there's been some positive developments. So we heard from Debbie Hewitt earlier. She's the first woman chair of the FA since it was formed back in 1863. So just let that sink in for a moment. The first woman to be appointed to the national governing body of football here in England. Laura hopefully will talk to us about that UEFA has just recently passed a change to its statutes to increase the number of women that will be on their executive committee. And we're aware that the FA board and council has also gone through recent reform. But I think it's felt from many, including women in football, that further reform is required. So today what we're going to be looking at, we've got sort of a real range of experience, knowledge and insights joining me on the stage. We'll look at sort of decision-making bodies in a number of different organisations, whether that be UEFA, whether that be sports leagues, whether that be clubs, and really have a look at sort of who sits around the decision-making table. Is there diversity? How are those people recruited? What can be done better? Is there a need for urgent reform? So I'm just going to hand over now to each of my experts just to briefly introduce themselves to the room and perhaps explain how you are working, what your role is within the governance of football. Mary, start with you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Harriet. So my name is Mary Galbraith. My most significant role in the context of being here is that I chair the Scottish Women's Premier League, which was set up in the summer of 2022. So we're not 2 years old yet. And so we're the league that runs the elite women's football in Scotland. So the top 2 leagues, 20 clubs. The 20 clubs themselves had been part of a big organisation that had got about 13 levels of the pyramid, and they felt it would be good to move away. And so a process was embarked upon. I ended up as a chair, and so that's a great thing that I do in kind of half a day a week, beside being a consultant and also being a programme director in one of the biggest business schools in the country. Also, I still sit on the Scottish FA's Equality and Diversity Advisory Board, where Ebru was also a very welcome member for some years.
Thanks, Mary. Patrick?
Thanks, Harriet. So I'm Patrick. I'm a partner at Portas Consulting. I lead all of our business in UK and Europe, and also lead our work in football, rugby, and women's sports globally. Very briefly, for those who don't know, Portas is a management consultancy that's dedicated to sports. So we work with leading sports bodies, governments, and private sector, advising them on their most kind of critical, complex, and urgent issues. To bring that to life, in women's football, we've done a significant amount of work with international federations such as UEFA, national associations ranging from the English FA, through to the Football Federation of Australia, through to the Saudi Arabian Football Federation, and many more. We also do a lot of work with leagues, so the WSL, but also around 10 different leagues globally and throughout Europe, as well as a lot of work with private investors looking to invest into women's sports. In terms of kind of our perspective on this, a lot of the work we do is advising our clients around how they can accelerate the commercial and professional development of women's sports. So we see a lot firsthand how governance can really be an enabler to that, but also a barrier to that if not done right. So we really kind of I'll come at this today, I think, from a really kind of business-minded perspective as to how does governance need to be set up to be able to really allow the women's game to achieve its full potential.
Thanks, Patrick. And Laura?
Thank you very much. Yes, I'm Laura McAllister. I was elected to the UEFA Exco last April, so I'm not quite, I haven't quite served my first year as yet. I was also appointed as vice president at the time, so I'm the first female vice president of UEFA. You'll probably have worked out by my accent that I'm from Wales. I'm a former Wales national team player and captain, and I've straddled the 2 areas of academia and sports governance, in that I'm an academic at Cardiff University, where I'm Professor of Governance, so my work around governance has an academic flavour as well, but I've tried to apply that in my engagement in the sports sector. I've been chair of Sport Wales, a member of the board of UK Sport. I'm deputy chair of the UEFA Women's Football Committee. I fought an unsuccessful election for FIFA Council in 2021, and then I was elected to UEFA Exco last year, the first Welsh person, by the way, on UEFA. And since then, because I think it's always really important to have a sense of purpose when one's doing these roles, so I've been very clear that I've wanted to try and enhance the representation of women within the structures of UEFA. So I played a long game, I think, on that, which I'm sure we'll talk about a bit later, but I'm currently heading up the new UEFA Gender Representation Working Group, which will look at all aspects of how we ensure that UEFA better reflects the sport as it is rather than as it was.
Thank you very much, Laura. And Lynsey?
Thanks, Harriet. So it's great to have an opportunity to be here today, and particularly to talk about governance and governing, a topic that I love. So my name is Lynsey Tweddle. I'm Strategic Lead Governance at Sport England, and I was also recently appointed as one of the first independent members of the FA's National Game Board, which has responsibilities for the grassroots game. Just to explain Sport England a little bit, we're an arm's-length body of government who invest lottery and some government money to remove barriers to sport and physical activity, so to make sure that anybody can access that in England. My role particularly is sector-facing, so I'm responsible for leading our policy work around good governance. That involves setting standards for governance, supporting bodies within the sector to be well governed, and in particular I, along with Jane Purden, who many people will know, be familiar with, that Women in Football co-wrote the Codes for Sports Governance. That sets high standards of governance and is mandatory for any organisation wanting to receive public investment from Sport England or UK Sport. It's applied proportionately within the sector, but it's been in place now for about 8 years, and I know we'll come on to talk about some of that, but really pleased to be here today and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much. Well, actually, Lynsey, we might start there if that's okay with you, because for those that don't know, there is no current code governing football, certainly here in the UK, although that is in motion. So, Lynsey, from your experience of, as you say, drafting, preparing the code of sports governance that applies to publicly funded bodies here, how did that come about? Because I know one of the pillars is people. So in your experience, what do you think is a fit-for-purpose, good corporate governance around people, whether that be the number around a decision-making table, their diversity, their skill set, how they're recruited, how long they stay in office? Could you just explain that, please?
Sure, and I think it's a great place to start people, because we can talk about all the governance structures and frameworks forever, but it's really the most important element is the people that are sitting in those structures, the people that are operating them, how they behave, the values that they demonstrate, how they work together. So the code itself came out of the government sports strategy in 2015, where there was an action for Sport England and UK Sport to draft basically a mandatory governance code for any organisation receiving public investment. And Jane and I worked on that and delivered that. That's been in place now for about 8 years. The second principle within that code is people. And the first 3 requirements within that principle are related to diversity and inclusion. So who sits around the table, making sure we revised the code in 2020 and looked particularly at diversity and inclusion, and that updated some of those requirements, and it now talks about making sure, well, organisations are required to have ambitious, robust plans in place for diversity at board and senior leadership level. The first iteration of the code required organisations to have a target of 30% gender representation, so to the point you were talking about earlier, Harriet, and Women in Football's agenda. Now it talks more generally about greater diversity amongst board and senior leadership, but making sure that's appropriate for the organisations. So I think the principle across all of the code is that it isn't just a framework that sits there. It needs to make sense for organisations and how they work, and that's proved, in our experience, a successful way of approaching it. Also in that principle section around people, there are requirements around directors having a written statement of responsibility, so being clear about what their responsibilities are, that there being appropriate induction frameworks in place, so when people join, they understand what they're required to do and how the organisation operates, and they feel included in those discussions, because you can have different people around the board table, but if they don't feel included in those discussions, then it really can be meaningless. And then there are other, threaded throughout the code, there are other requirements around people to do with how conflicts are managed. So if you've got different people within the room and people might have conflicts, whether they need to step out or how they can be managed. There's also requirements around independence, so amongst decision-making, having some independence within that decision-making. Also something you called out at the start around the Women in Football agenda. So a range of requirements around people, because they are the most important element in decision-making and governance.
And just picking up specifically on that when the first iteration was 30%, as you say, exactly the same as what the Women in Football Open Doors agenda is calling on decision-making bodies to ensure that their senior decision-making bodies have that. And then it evolved into sort of that greater diversity into both senior leadership and the board. Do you feel that you would have to sort of have a percentage of women representation on senior decision-making boards first before you could then evolve it? Or do you feel that, for example, when the football governance code comes in, that there might be something that you go quicker to, a broader ambition around diversity?
Yeah. I mean, I think having that 30% target in the first iteration of the code definitely changed things.
Yeah.
It was a target, so, I think, but organisations took it as a mandatory requirement. It couldn't be a mandatory requirement in law, but organisations approached it in that way. So it did generate change, and a lot of organisations embedded that within their own governance structures. So the latest iteration was a development of that, but I think it was a really important flag for change and highlighted it and surfaced that. So it did, we did see change happening, and we're just about to, we've periodically conducted surveys amongst the sector on diversity generally, and we're just about to conduct another one, so it will be interesting to see the change. I think the last one, which was in 2020, showed 44% women on boards, and so it's increased at each stage that survey's been done, so it will be really interesting to see what the percentage is in this latest one.
Thank you, Lynsey. Laura, I'm absolutely desperate to ask you just how that whole change regarding the statutes of UEFA to double the amount of women, bearing in mind that's just 1 to 2, we'll perhaps come on to the numbers in a moment, but from the inside in, how did that come about? What did the process entail? You're on this new working group, so what is there still to be done to bring that change into effect, please?
Well, self-evidently, there's a lot to be done. I'm currently the only woman on UEFA's board. And let me just tell you a bit about that first, because, it has been it's been a troubled experience, let's say. I've been used to working with more diverse organisations, both professionally and personally, and now I'm suddenly the only woman in virtually every room that I'm at. Helped, no doubt, by being a vice president, because I've had access to some of the executive and presidential side where I've been able to voice my concerns about that. But I've learned a lot in my first 11 months in the role. Firstly, that we in the countries of the United Kingdom are sometimes culturally blind to how little other nations think about equality and diversity. We need to be much better culturally attuned to the fact that the debate on these areas in other countries, not necessarily the ones you might think actually, is very, very immature. That was exemplified certainly in the fallout from the Luis Rubiales incident, where there were lots of federations who felt that he'd done absolutely nothing wrong, and I was told that regularly. The second thing I've learned is that you absolutely have to have a sense of purpose and strategy in terms of making an impact, because as the only woman there, and I think one of few reformers within the environment, I've got to be very clear about what I can try and achieve to improve the governance of European football. That often means keeping my mouth shut rather than opening it, which is difficult for all of us who have very strong opinions about principles and values. But I'm a strong believer in that when you speak, it's very easy to be heard. It's much harder to be listened to. And speaking in response to incidents like the Rubiales thing will give you a little bit of personal satisfaction and pleasure, especially on social media where everybody will support you, or most people will support you. However, it will achieve absolutely nothing in terms of changing the cultural environment that we're working in European football. So I've had to be very tactical and very pragmatic about what I've tried to do. There is a kind of point to what I'm saying, because I immediately spoke to the president after the World Cup final, and I made it clear to him that I felt we needed to do a project within UEFA about misogyny in the game, because the Rubiales incident illustrated much deeper problems. The incident itself is not the biggest thing. The fact that it represents a lot of the structural and power relationships we have in football is much more important. But the truth of the matter is, it's taken me 7 months to persuade UEFA to let me loose on that project. But now we will change things, and this takes us back to the statute matter. Before I was elected to UEFA Exco, I was on a gender equality working group, and one of our recommendations was that we should immediately double the number of quota places there are for women on UEFA Exco. That's now happened with the statute change. So from 2025, we'll have 2 women on Exco. Now, you can look at that one of 2 ways. You can either say that's still ridiculously low, which of course it is, but on the other hand, it's twice what we've got now. It's a 100% increase. And there is no way in the world, in the cultural environment of European football, that things will change quickly. So, take your pick out of those scenarios. You can either throw your hands in the air and say it's not good enough, or you can say we've made an important stride. We now have the working group that I'm chairing, so I've been able to frame the terms of reference for that, and the membership, by the way. So we've got good members who can really accelerate this. And our work will be on elected positions, so hence, ExCo in UEFA, appointed positions, really important for gender, because UEFA has something like 600 committee places, which at the moment are filled mainly by men. We've had progress, but only about 18% are female. And thirdly, the administration and the executive. So we've got 3 goes at this agenda, really, really important agenda. But it's meant me being tactical. It's meant me not speaking up when I'd like to speak up. And it's meant me developing relationships with people that, quite frankly, don't see the world in the same way that we do. But if that's what it takes to make progress, then I think there's a lesson there for all of us women in football, which is we have to be pragmatic, and we have to be expedient, and we have to find a way of doing something rather than talking about it.
Yeah, and an interesting point there, that you can have the quotas or the percentages of X percentage of women represented on these committees, on the boards, but it's how do they actually get onto those boards and committees in the first place? So in ExCo's case, I believe that the vast majority of the members are elected. So where are the candidates actually coming from? So if the component parts are predominantly male, then it's going to struggle to fill those percentages. 2 out of 20, would you sort of, through your work, have you got a figure in mind as to what you'd like the split in the future to be on the ExCo at UEFA?
Well, it should be 50-50. But look, that's the kind of debate we'll have in the working group, because I'll make sure we have it. But I'm also very cognizant that we have to persuade the most senior people within UEFA to come on the journey with us. So there will be stages towards that. If we go in all guns blazing and demand a pure equality of representation, then we'll be knocked back at the first hurdle. So it's back to what I said about being realistic and pragmatic. And first of all, we need to find ways of persuading some of the federations who really don't see this as being important or a priority for them, that it can be a beneficial development. And that's back to what we've always talked about, which is the business case of diversity and the value that greater diversity, not just of women, but of other underrepresented groups, brings to the table. And for me, having been involved in the governance of sport for a long time, pretty much everything comes back to governance. The frenetic match calendar, we were talking about this at breakfast this morning for the women's game, comes because we haven't had enough women involved at the early stages of the development of the match calendar and the competition structure. The same with technical matters and with medical matters. So everything comes back to governance. So we have to really invest in that. For me, it's about making gains that are tangible, that will affect everybody in this room in terms of what you do in football. It's some women in football, by the way, have just stood up and criticised everything that UEFA are doing. Good luck to you if you want to do that, by the way, but it won't get you anywhere. It'll satisfy yourself and the people around you, but it will get you absolutely nowhere, because immediately the shutters will come down and you'll be regarded as a problem woman who shouldn't be at the table in the first place. So therefore, you're being heard, but you're not being listened to and engaged with, which is back to the point I was making about ensuring that happens, really.
Thank you, Laura. Mary, I want to come to you next, if that's okay, because it's sort of a stark contrast for me when I was looking into the ExCo and the composition of ExCo, and Mary, as we were saying, chairs the Scottish Premier Women's League, where actually the makeup of that board is much more gender balanced. So I think, is it 4 women that are serving directors and 5 males? So as a chair, what's that like? Because as Laura just said, there's no argument that diversity makes business sense, and there's studies to back it up. What's it like being the chair of an organisation where there is more diversity around the table? And in your opinion, does that make better business?
I think, thanks, Harriet, and really interesting to hear the perspectives of Lynsey and Laura up till now. For me, being in the room where it's equal, roughly, it's 4-5, 5-4, is is not unusual, if you like, because I've not chaired organisations that have been kind of like 10 men and 1 woman. So I'm starting at it, not naively, but just taking things at face value and saying everyone here is equal and not assuming that anyone has got more or less insight, because they all come from quite different backgrounds. And the way the board is composed, I mean, I'm delighted to say, the process adhered to some of the things Lynsey was talking about. The 2 non-executive positions, my own and the other independent non-exec, there were public adverts with role profiles, expectation and explanation of what was involved, and an interview process that the rest of the board, the executive, the elected members of the board were involved in making the selection, because fundamentally the league is there for the clubs, and so they have a majority. There are 5 club representatives and 4 others, so the 2 non-execs plus a nomination from the SPFL board, who's the holding company effectively, and we're the subsidiary, albeit completely autonomous, and the managing director, who happens to be female. So on the non-executive, it's 1 male, 1 female. On the nominated from the holding company, it's 1 male, 1 female. And the clubs initially elected 3 women, 2 men, and right now it's 3 men and 2 women. So as close to 50-50 as you're going to get. But that's because the clubs put forward women. And so a lot of this, it's great to get the right representation in UEFA and the FA and in leagues, but if you haven't got it at club level, you don't have that talent coming through. Where are the people going to come from who are going to be nominated? And it isn't just any woman that a club can nominate, you know, someone who happens to be, you know, the sort of, I don't know, head physio who happens to be a female. It has to be someone who is either a director or that the board authorises to have significant control. You're not there as some kind of mouthpiece or delegate of your club. You are there as a body of 9 to be part of that community, to set out the agenda and make decisions for the whole league.
Yeah, it's very interesting, and we do come across that time and time again, where there's boards where there is club-nominated directors, to give that right to clubs, noting that they're a key stakeholder to ensure the success of your league. But actually, do they have free rein to appoint whoever they like, or is it that there is a sort of limited pool, be it sort of through the club, whether that needs to link back to a director's skill matrix? So, you know, the success of the Scottish Women's League is so critical actually on who's around that decision-making table making sound decisions for your league going forward.
Yeah, and it also has given us a chance not to just take that top level of the elite level of the women's football in Scotland and give it the attention it deserves. And it's a kind of it's a shift that's happening in a different way in England as well, where the Elite Women's League is making its own transformation. So we did that about a year or 2 ahead. And that time to just say, actually, this organisation has one job. You have one job, to promote the women's elite game, to have more professional women athletes, that they're better paid, they're better supported with the right medical cover, they have careers, they have the right infrastructure and support, and that the women's game is enjoyed by as many people as possible. So we've been able to get attention on the contracts, making some tough choices about what kind of commercial deals we're going to do and what we're not going to do. Yep. And having that diversity around the table is great. It's refreshing. I take a bit of a kind of fearless attitude to the whole business, which was when I was being interviewed, they said, look, you've got to sum yourself up in one word. And so I said fearless, because I'd also said beforehand, when they asked me, why are you interested in this? And I said, well, feminism and football, it doesn't get much better. And so feminism, football and fearlessness, I suppose, then are where I'm taking it. But it just means that I'm focused, we're all focused on our purpose. And if you're clear about what that purpose is, then some of the discussions, and they can be tough discussions, and the decisions that we then all reach and all get behind become a lot easier. And so it is a really, I find quite, and the people on the board tell me, I have sort of regular one-to-ones with them, that it's a productive, healthy thing, which interestingly, the SPFL, the men's league, is very much more constrained and nominated. We we make the decisions.
Yeah.
We don't need to reference back to clubs and divisional bodies. It's quite refreshing, and we're pretty happy with it so far.
Thank you, Mary, and it'll be interesting to see NUCO, but other women's sports as well, as to how they set up their boards in recent, well, sort of soon-to-be decisions. Patrick, we've talked a bit about sort of having gender representation, having club-appointed directors, but one of the other sort of requirements of the Open Doors agenda was around the player's voice and getting that to come through into decision making and ensuring that there's fit for purpose policies around that. Through your work, working across all the clients that you earlier referred to, how do you see that working well in practice in terms of bringing the players into decision making?
Yeah, thank you, Harriet. I think it's a really good question, and a question we get asked a lot around how to have that effective player representation. I think kind of our first starting point on that question is always to, I guess, just question that word representation. I think if the question is more framed around how can we make sure there's a real understanding of player experience in our board and our decision making, great. I think if the question's framed around how can we make sure there's player representation, I think our advice there is always to take care. And I think the reason for that is often if you start from a point of representation, that kind of leads you down a path of that's representation on a single issue. It's often, therefore, not diverse. And it's often, I guess, an elected position as well. And I think that leads you to all the challenges that sport has around it being quite difficult to make decisions and difficult to really kind of contribute to a broad range of issues if you're elected by an electorate to kind of represent them on a single issue. So I think our advice is always to really think about kind of player experience first and making sure that understanding of player experience is a requirement in a skills matrix so that is represented on the board. I think our other piece of advice here is I guess to really make sure you're not putting all the burden on the players and on the women in the board to represent and to have that understanding of that player experience. So if I go to some of our work in rugby, I think that kind of helps bring the point to life. So as you might recently know, the British and Irish Lions are launching a women's tour, the first ever women's tour, which is going to take place in 2027. And actually, if you think about how they did that work, they went to players and they said, do you want a women's Lions tour? A very natural response, if you've grown up watching rugby, playing rugby, is to say, well, of course, absolutely I do. This is something that is iconic, I want to be part of that. But actually, is that the right thing for the sport? Is that the right thing for the players at this moment in time? To kind of recreate something that's already existing on the men's side and to apply that to the women's side? Is that the right area of the game to invest into? I think you could put a big question mark against that. And I think it's also, it's not just kind of players or not, but also I think it's expecting that of men on the board as well, of men involved in the process, to make sure they're understanding and thinking about the women's player experience. So if I think about some of the work we've done in the Football Federation of Australia with James Johnson, if you speak to him, he's not reliant on having a kind of a player representative in the board. He really understands kind of what is the experience of a current Matilda or a future Matilda. And you can see some of that has really been demonstrating the success they've had and the tremendous advancements they've made. I think the third thing to consider in all of this is just, I guess, the role and the support given to the CEO. Governance is becoming increasingly diverse and broad, which is super. But I guess in practice, what that ends up with is often you're a CEO with a player on your board. You also have a CEO of an advertising agency, someone from outside of sport who comes from a completely different perspective. And that's wonderful to have all of those different inputs and insights coming into you. But it's also really hard. Like, how do I play off someone who's been a player and is deeply entrenched in the game, maybe quite conservative? How do I play that off against someone who brings in that really different external third-party perspective? And that's not easy. It's really hard to get to effective decisions and facilitate effective meetings in that. So I think there is a real imperative as well to think about what support CEOs and chairs need to be able to actually really operate effectively in that environment.
Great, thank you very much. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to throw it open to the floor in just a moment. But has anybody, and I'll just open this up to the panel, but obviously this session is all about the case for the urgent need of further reform. So is there anything from your work that you're seeing, say I'll throw this open, that you think, yeah, this is one thing that I would like to see change or that we still need to drive forward?
Yeah, I'm happy to start. Yep. I think from our side, probably, I think if you look at women's sports, it's a really challenging, it has a lot of challenges in front of it. So I think if you think about men's sport and how that's developed over the last 100 years, it's either happened in two ways. One being kind of a very slow bottom-up build-up from grassroots, becoming amateur and then professional, and then having kind of commercial proposition viability over a very long period of time. As you've seen in Europe, you also have models in the US and other parts of the world where it's been kind of top-down and franchise and out. So I think as we think about governance, I think it's really important to remember that women's sport is trying to do both at the same time, and no one's ever really tried to do that before, and that is a really difficult challenge. So for me, like, what do you need to be able to address that challenge? You need to be able to do two things. One, you need to be kind of super top-down and really bold in your decision-making to really design the sport, the business, the governance really differently. The other thing you need to be able to do is be quite business-minded. Like, women's sport is fantastic, but the financial goals it's setting itself are also quite difficult, and the level of pace and development is happening at a really quick rate. So you can't really, as a sport and as an industry, afford to leave much value on the table. You need to be really efficient, you need to be really effective, and I think you can only really do that if you approach things in a really business-minded way, where you get everyone working together against a very clear plan with real crystal clear accountability and responsibility. So again, I think from a governance perspective, how can I make sure that my governance allows me to take those really tough, bold decisions, to be really integrated, really effective, and have that business-minded approach.
Yeah, and it's much easier when there's actually the ability for you to do that. You're not shackled to, say men's infrastructure. Laura?
Yeah, I wanted to just make a case for a better discussion about the merits of quotas, because I'm increasingly frustrated in this conversation in that I know a lot of us as women feel that quotas represent a failure on our part as a route to get into authority. And I think we've got sucked into a very male and patriarchal debate about quotas. I don't want to go down the academic route of talking about this, but there is no doubt at all in my mind that quotas have to be used currently because we don't have a meritocracy. If we had a meritocracy, you wouldn't need quotas. But if you think we have a meritocracy, you're essentially saying that white men are cleverer than non-white men because they control all of the positions in football currently, most of the positions, and globally in other sectors, by the way. So women, I think, some of us have got sucked into having to sort of feel uncomfortable about quotas and say, I don't want to go through a quota route. I want to be elected through a normal procedure. I've heard it in UEFA. I've heard it through some women that I massively admire,
well,
by the way.
that's happened in UEFA recently, hasn't it?
Yeah. Well, it hasn't happened. The voices have been raised about quotas by some individuals without thinking through why we need them. And this is a really delicate conversation. But I would really plead you all to think about this differently. If you're happy to just let the current situation continue and pretend it's a meritocracy, okay, because believe me, it isn't, then we will simply not advance women's representation until a very, very long time down the road, okay? If we use quotas, we can also instigate the cultural change at the same time. So quotas are not everything, but they are a way of getting women, in this case, onto UEFA's ExCo. There'll be 2 of us by 2025, which will be a joy for me, believe me. But we will then have a stronger voice. So let's get away from this kind of idea that quotas are in some way a second-class route to election and that they produce less talented individuals. They don't, by the way. Everybody I've seen who's come through a quota is stronger. They're actually better than the people who've come through the other route. So I'm saying this partly to myself because I'm having to fight this battle in UEFA, but also to all the women out there who get sucked into a patriarchal debate about quotas. Please think about it differently because we desperately need them, or it will take us 5 other generations to get more women into power.
Sorry, I was referring to, is it Lynsey Klaveness?
Lynsey Klaveness,
who wouldn't...
Great person.
Yeah, who wanted to be in the main process rather than take up the women's seat.
Lynsey is a good friend of mine. Lynsey is president of Norway, FA. Great friend of mine, and we've had this debate. And I think I'm persuading her down this route. She might tell you otherwise. But, her argument was she didn't want to stand against me in the UEFA election for ExCo. Get that. She wanted to stand in the general election process. absolutely fine, but she got battered, you know. So let's be brutal about this. As I've said to her, she had the least number of votes of the candidates. Shouldn't have had that, of course, because she's far more talented than the other candidates standing. But that's where we are. I want Lisa on ExCo with us, or people like Lisa, so therefore we'll hopefully persuade her to look at the quota route as a way of ensuring that she's there and can change it from within. So that's the kind of debate that I think we've got to have, actually.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Laura. Okay. Well, I'm going to throw it open to the room for questions to our experts. At the front here, please. I'll get a mic to you. If you'd just like to introduce yourself and then ask your question.
Yeah, sure. So, hi, I'm Ella Williams from Leeds University Union, and thanks to the panel. That was all super interesting. My question's mostly to Laura, but obviously anyone else chip in. You spoke about when you, with UEFA, you worked with federations who, particularly during the Rubiales situation, didn't feel like he'd necessarily done anything wrong. You talked about your sort of strategy there, playing a bit of a long game, and working with them, and I'm sure you're still doing it, to see the benefit in investing in women's sport. But you also talked about others whose approach would perhaps be a bit different, to be a bit louder, to scream and shout a little bit more. My question is, do you feel pressure from those people who are also, you know, your allies in this? Do you feel pressure from them to sort of change your approach, perhaps? And if you don't change your approach, how do you bring them along with you and convince them that you are doing the right thing?
Shall I answer that? Or do you want more questions?
Yeah, you know, why don't you take it? It was directed at you, and then...
I guess the answer is yes, I do feel pressure, but I've felt pressure for the whole of the time I've been on UEFA ExCo, from different sides and up and down and from left and right and so on. So I'm getting used to that kind of push-pull that's always there. But the way I've tried to strategize around that is that it's really important to bring the federations with us on this journey. There's 55 federations, each of them has a vote. And if I don't want to sound critical of the English FA, if anybody from the English FA is here, but that's one of the things that I don't think the English FA have quite operationalized. They have no more vote or power than any other federations, such as Kazakhstan or Liechtenstein or San Marino or the Faroe Islands. They might have more status, but they don't have more power, and those are different things. Maybe coming from a small to medium federation like Wales, which is an incredibly successful football nation, but we're not, you know, one of the big football countries, gives me the freedom to find a way of working with the different federations. They like what we're doing in Wales, and I think most of the smaller federations look up to us and what we're doing. Therefore, we have an in to talk to them about the other work we're doing around equality and respect and transparency and good governance and so on. Then on the other hand, you know, obviously I have a role and a status within UEFA, so I can talk to the bigger federations about why it's important to find a path through all of this that will eventually bring the dividends that we hope, you know, will benefit the more advanced nations on equality. So it is a delicate balance, for sure, but it's one that I think, you know, as leaders in football, we've got to find a way of managing, really. And I'm confident that at the moment, the path that I've tried to pursue is bringing more dividends than another path, an alternative path might have done. That might change, of course. It might go belly up at any moment. I understand how these things work. But for now, I think we're on the right path, and it requires the delicate negotiation and balance of liaising with all of those different federations simultaneously.
Yeah, Harry.
Yeah, I was just going to say, sometimes this is painted as a choice, that we have to go with you know, the quota route and compliance, and we're going to beat people up if they don't get it. But actually, I think it's more, and it's either that or nothing. I think our tactics and our strategy ought to be along the lines of, we need to, yes, require compliance, but also build commitment. So it's this commitment-compliance dilemma that is sometimes presented. We need to do both. We need to, I think, as Laura has set out, think that quotas are realistically the way we're going to get anywhere near parity in under a century. But at the same time, we don't want people reluctantly, oh, I had to get, you know, all that attitude. We need to build commitment. And there's so much research out there that talks about why having more women on your board is good. You're going to have more views, more opinions, more pursue better angles, be more attractive to a lot of commercial partners. There are so many good, positive reasons that can build active commitment. So this commitment compliance thing is something I think we need to be a bit more subtle about and actually have some tactics and strategies in place to do both. So to incentivize, to give clubs, do we ever reward clubs that get that more or less parity without a quota? Who could name a club that is doing that and doing well? Let's reward and incentivize and recognize the good practice rather than beat up with a quota requirement that clubs and other organisations that don't, would be my exhortation.
Thank you. You've got us all talking. Lynsey.
Just to build on Mary's point there, so of course the code is a mandatory code and people talk about compliance all the time, but I always steer away from trying to use the words compliance and enforcement because I think the approach we've tried to adopt by working with partners and getting them and them seeing the benefits of it has been much more fruitful than sort of treating it as a box ticking exercise or something that they've got to do because they have to do it. Albeit there are things within it that have definitely sort of the lever of public money has definitely made change happen. So that sits there underneath it all, but it's not. If I'm speaking about it, I always try and avoid the sort of enforcement element of it because it just doesn't get you anywhere in the long term. So I support completely what you were saying there.
Yeah. Unless anybody stops me, I'm going to take one more question from the in the middle here by the pillar. We'll get a mic over to you.
Hi, my question is for
Ooh,
Mary.
Introduce yourself.
Sorry. Hi, I'm Lowry Roberts, formerly head of women's football at the Welsh FA, but 9 weeks into self-employment. Ooh, go me. My question is to Mary, because you're talking about a new board and a new pathway for women's football in Scotland now. But as women's football teams and clubs become fully integrated into men's big professional clubs, as we're seeing in Scotland, right? How do you ensure that those voices around your table or the insight that you're picking up on is based around what is right for women's football rather than the men's side of that club influencing and using some of their muscle? And maybe could you give us an example of what you're doing in Scotland that's really quite courageous or innovative, that isn't the constant, this is the way it's always been done in the men's game, and seeing kind of that new route? So sorry, that's two questions in one, if that's okay.
Yeah, and I think what you're expressing really is almost, and excuse me if I'm wrong, but it's almost like the kind of aspiration and the inspiration that we identify in the women's game. How are we protecting it? Because there's a kind of a special culture, and we don't want that just squashed by some of the kind of more patriarchal attitudes and ways of going about things. And our board is part of that. We are completely autonomous. So if anyone thinks that, all that's happened in Scotland is, the 20 top men's clubs, their women's teams are a league, it's not. We have clubs, some of our 20 clubs have no men's club. They are autonomous women-only clubs. We also have clubs in our SWPL whose men's clubs aren't in the SPFL. So our structure represents our 20 clubs. And we're quite clear about that. We're going to take the decisions that are right for us. And so some of the things that we're doing differently is we're talking to different commercial partners. There are different ones who are interested in talking to us than are interested in the men's game, because there's a different demographic that, as we all know, that women's football attracts. So we are, in some ways, I think, actually, if I were sitting in a club, kind of mid-table, I'd be saying, oh my gosh, our women's team could be the saviour of this club, because they look at and I wish more clubs would think this way, they look at their male fan base, there may be in their 50s and 60s is a typical supporter whose family finances are quite distressed by having to pay a male season ticket, which is not insignificant, and that's tough. And they've bought their house, their other half takes a decision on where they spend their money and go on holiday, it's really not very attractive for commercial advertisers to want to get close to the male supporter of that club. Whereas the average supporter of their female club is going to be younger, you know, more middle class, have more disposable income, probably a parent with young kids, more family friendly. It's a completely different demographic. So the clubs could look at their women's team, and some do. So don't get me, I'm not saying they're all kind of dragging their knuckles, but women's teams could, for many clubs, be a kind of salvation. They can diversify their fan base, they can grow new future season ticket holders in the male game, they can provide an affordable outlet for people who love the brand of their club. And so we're making that possible without making it explicit, I think. I don't know if I've answered all your questions. There was like a mix in there.
SPL board.
We do at one level. We don't collaborate in a kind of integrated way. We do what's right for our 20 clubs.
Does the Scottish Males League, do they have any sort of final say or golden share type protection? No.
Nope.
Okay. We're out of time, but thank you so much for all your questions, and thank you very much to my panels this morning.